Racist cop pulls gun. On black judge in court. What happens? Next. Silences the room. Shots can ring out in the most unexpected places, and the sanctity of a courthouse should be the last spot you'd imagine gunfire echoing through the marble halls. Yet one fateful morning at the Richard J. Daley Center in downtown Chicago, a terrifying confrontation shattered that belief. Tension between a seasoned black judge, Harriet Barnes, and a hot-headed police officer, Derek O'Connor, erupted before stunned court officials. Witnesses would later swear that time itself froze as a gun was drawn, not on a dangerous criminal, but on the presiding judge herself. What happened next left the entire room silent and changed lives forever. Harriet Barnes had walked through the tall glass doors of the Richard J. Daley Center more times than she could count. Even after a decade on the bench, she still felt the same sense of awe whenever she traversed the grand lobby, with its soaring ceilings, the occasional echo of footsteps punctuating the stillness. She'd grown up in Chicago's South Side, passing by that iconic, towering building as a child, never imagining she'd someday preside over cases within its walls as one of the city's most respected judges. 45 years old, dignified and with a disarming warmth behind her steely professionalism, Judge Barnes had become a beacon of fairness in a justice system that often felt anything but. She had battled bias on her climb to the bench. An Ivy League law degree seemed to matter little to those predisposed to question her abilities because of her race. Yet Harriet pressed on, determined to forge a path built on merit, unwavering ethics, and a desire to see true justice served. That morning, Harriet sipped her tea in her chambers before heading to courtroom 25C. She reviewed a docket loaded with the usual suspects: small claims, disputes a handful of pretrial motions, and one hearing involving an excessive force complaint against a police officer. The first cases were routine, a civil matter about a contract dispute, a motion for summary judgment in a personal injury suit. Harriet handled each with her characteristic blend of empathy and impartiality. Outside the courthouse windows, the early spring sun cast fleeting beams onto the city streets below. A swirl of mid-morning traffic hustled along. People rushed from one appointment to the next, and the rhythmic pulse of Chicago life thrummed. Harriet thought about how she cherished these small, almost mundane details, the normalcy of everyday life, because in her line of work, she was often reminded how quickly normal could be shattered. She glanced down at the docket again, eyes narrowing on the excessive force hearing. The defendant, Officer Derek O'Connor, a name she only vaguely recognized. He had served on the Chicago Police Department for just under a decade. The case pinned him to a violent arrest of a young protester outside a community rally. The prosecuting attorney alleged that not only did O'Connor assault the protester, but that he used racial slurs during the arrest. Harriet had seen her share of both justified and exaggerated claims against officers. She intended to be fair and let the facts guide her as always. Still, there was an inexplicable heaviness stirring inside her, a sense that this hearing would be anything but routine. She shook it off, took another measured sip of her tea, then gathered her notes. The time to begin was close. With a deep breath, Harriet composed herself and reminded her inner self to remain impartial. She had faced racism in her youth, as well as the subtle brand of prejudice that clung to certain corners of the legal profession. But once she put on those judicial robes, she was simply, Your Honor. That principle of justice above all else was the guide she lived by. She made her way to the bench. The worn wood of the judge's seat and the clang of the gavel were as familiar as the lines on her own palm. It was time for the next case. A bailiff announced in a solemn voice, "The court calls case number 23-8472, State of Illinois versus Officer Derek O'Connor." Officer Derek O'Connor was not what one might call a model policeman. In his mid-30s, tall with broad shoulders, he had a no-nonsense look that veered precariously close to hostility. He strode into the courtroom, flanked by his attorney, Detective Sergeant Paul Klein, who had taken on the dual role of friend and legal counsel after the Fraternal Order of Police assigned him. O'Connor's eyes flicked around the room. Soft murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some curious, others visibly distraught from past experiences. Harriet's first glimpse of the officer left her unsettled. It wasn't his physical presence alone. It was the determined scowl, the quick clenches of his jaw, the almost imperceptible shaking of his hands when he thought no one was looking. Where Harriet maintained an air of professionalism, O'Connor's body language radiated pent-up aggression. He had been in the CPD for about a decade and had drawn complaints of misconduct more than once. Yet, like too many times before, those complaints seldom reached a courtroom. This time, however, a video of the incident surfaced, circulated on social media, and sparked a degree of public outrage. It became too big to brush under the rug. Judge Barnes began the proceedings. Officer O'Connor. She said, her voice calm but firm. "You stand accused of excessive use of force during an arrest that took place on April 10th of this year. How do you plead?" O'Connor's lawyer answered, "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge nodded. She glanced at the prosecutor. Assistant State's Attorney Milana Jespers, who presented a stack of documents and a flash drive containing the now infamous video. The hush in the room was thick with anticipation. Would this open and shut video evidence finally hold a cop accountable for racial bias? Or would it falter under legal technicalities? As the video played, a hush fell, except for the echo of distorted shouts captured by a cell phone camera. The footage showed an altercation near an inner-city park. The crowd was protesting a rent hike in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. Tensions ran high. A young protester in a bright green jacket confronted O'Connor, who responded by shoving him against a patrol car. Audible in the background was a string of curses from O'Connor, laced with slurs that made Harriet's stomach twist. The protester, no older than 20, did not strike back. O'Connor, however, continued applying pressure, knee in the protester's back, even as the young man's screams grew desperate. Harriet's expression remained neutral, but inside she felt that old anger simmer. The anger she worked so hard to control whenever she encountered blatant injustice. Once the video concluded, the prosecution rested its preliminary arguments on the evidence. The defense, meanwhile, claimed that the alleged slurs were garbled audio, that O'Connor faced an aggressive crowd and responded with appropriate force, and that the protester was resisting arrest. Throughout it all, Harriet watched O'Connor's face. A cold determination flickered in his eyes. He was not a man on the verge of admitting any wrongdoing. In fact, every fiber of his being seemed to bristle with indignation at the court at the charges, and perhaps at Harriet herself for presiding. She scheduled a follow-up hearing for the afternoon, giving the defense time to prepare their official response. Just as she signaled the end of the morning session, O'Connor locked eyes with her. For a fleeting second, Harriet felt the weight of his stare. It wasn't merely the defiance of a man who believed he was wronged. There was something more ominous in that gaze, an ugly resentment that set her on edge. During the midday break, Harriet retreated to her chambers. She pressed her hands against the cool surface of her mahogany desk, took a deep breath, and recalled her early years as a public defender. The irony wasn't lost on her. Back then, she often defended young black men who found themselves at the mercy of law enforcement officers, similar to O'Connor. Now the roles were reversed. She was the judge, a symbol of authority, and O'Connor was the defendant, the symbol of institutional power under scrutiny. She thought about her father, a retired mail carrier, who marched with the Reverend Jesse Jackson in the 1980s, forever preaching that justice was an uphill march, but one that had to be walked. Harriet's father used to remind her, "The robe is not just a job, Harriet. It's a responsibility." She carried that lesson with her into every case. A soft rap on the chamber door stirred Harriet from her reflection. It was her law clerk, Trevor Kim, a second-year grad student who possessed a sharp mind and unyielding optimism. "Judge, sorry to bother you, but the afternoon hearing starts soon," Trevor said. "Also, I got word that the public is packing the gallery. Seems word spread about that video." Harriet nodded. She paused to gather her thoughts, well aware that public attention could fuel tensions. "Thank you, Trevor. Let's head there." As Harriet left her chambers, a throng of reporters lined the hallway. Camera shutters clicked with frantic energy. Microphones jutted toward her. Journalists peppered her with questions about the upcoming hearing, about Chicago's fraught relationship with its police force, about her personal stance on the matter. Harriet maintained a practiced neutrality. "I'm committed to evaluating the facts and the law," she said simply, then proceeded into the court. Inside the courtroom, the energy crackled. More spectators had filed in. Community activists, off-duty police officers, and curious members of the public crammed onto the pew-like benches. Harriet took her seat at the bench, scanning the crowd. She saw a couple of known activists from Chicago's South Side. Near them, she noticed a group of uniformed officers, faces stern with solidarity. Officer O'Connor sat at the defense table, his posture rigid and restless. Harriet sensed the tension coiled within him. His attorney, Detective Sergeant Klein, tried to exude confidence, but even he looked uneasy as spectators whispered and judges from other courtrooms poked their heads in, alerted by the unusual buzz. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. After Harriet instructed everyone to be seated, the prosecution called a key witness, the young protester Malik Reese, who had been pinned to the car in the video. Malik described his experience, how he joined the demonstration against gentrification in his neighborhood, how the police presence escalated the situation, and how O'Connor singled him out among the crowd. "He shoved me," Malik testified, voice trembling. "I didn't do anything to provoke him. Then he called me. I don't want to repeat it in court." He swallowed, eyes flicking toward Harriet, who gave him a reassuring nod. But it was a racial slur. Harriet caught the flicker of something in O'Connor's face, perhaps guilt or, more likely, resentment at hearing the charges spoken aloud. The defense retorted that Malik had refused to disperse, blocked the street, and allegedly tried to strike Officer O'Connor. A second witness took the stand, one of Malik's friends, who had also recorded the now viral video. He insisted that Malik never attempted to hit O'Connor. The prosecution played that segment of the video in slow motion. It showed Malik's arms raised as though to shield his face. Nowhere was there a strike. As the back and forth continued, the tension in the courtroom mounted. More than once, Harriet had to remind both sides to maintain decorum. She noticed O'Connor's attorney frantically whispering to his client, possibly urging him to keep his composure. Yet Harriet couldn't help but sense that O'Connor was a ticking time bomb. The afternoon hearing adjourned with Harriet announcing she would allow the video as evidence, rejecting the defense's motion to suppress it on technical grounds. As soon as she banged her gavel and declared recess, a clamor erupted among the spectators. Journalists rushed out to file updates. Activists whispered about possible protests in support of Malik, and uniformed cops glared in silent anger. Harriet retreated to her chambers, but she didn't find peace there. Not 5 minutes had passed before there was another knock at her door. This time, it was O'Connor himself, accompanied by his attorney. "Your Honor," said Sergeant Klein, "forgive the intrusion. Officer O'Connor wishes to clarify a few points directly. He feels the court is not hearing his side fairly." His voice was polite, but Harriet couldn't miss the undercurrent of tension. Harriet regarded them calmly, though her instincts told her this was irregular. "Officer O'Connor, protocol, states that any communication with the court, especially while in trial, should go through your counsel and be on the record. Whatever concerns you have should be addressed in open court." O'Connor's face tightened. "I just need you to understand something," he said, stepping forward. His eyes blazed with an intensity that made Harriet's nerves flare. "I was doing my job out there. But you people don't see it that way. There it was, you people." Harriet's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd encountered countless microaggressions in her life, but rarely had she been confronted with such brazen disrespect from someone standing before her as an officer of the law. "Officer O'Connor," she began evenly, "I will not entertain ex parte discussions about your case, and I would strongly advise you to follow proper procedures and address the court through your attorney." His fists clenched. For a moment, Harriet thought he might lunge forward, but Klein placed a hand on O'Connor's arm, guiding him out. "Apologies, Your Honor," the attorney said hastily. "We'll see you in court tomorrow." They left, but a lingering chill remained in Harriet's chambers. The raw hostility in O'Connor's eyes was unmistakable. She took a moment to center herself, reminding herself of her duty to remain impartial. Yet a quiet alarm sounded in her mind. This man was dangerous, and not just in the sense of being physically imposing. He was a powder keg of anger and bigotry that seemed on the verge of explosion. By the next morning, the local news was ablaze with coverage of the case. Prominent activists decried yet another display of police brutality. Some of the more conservative outlets questioned whether Harriet could judge objectively given her race and the nature of the allegations. The tension felt thicker in the courthouse halls. People whispered Harriet's name as she passed, some in support, others in suspicion. A quiet storm also brewed within the police force. Some officers believed O'Connor had gone too far and privately hoped Harriet would serve justice. Others saw him as a scapegoat of an overly critical media environment. Harriet could sense the pressure from both sides. The entire city seemed to be bracing for the next development. Before the session started, Harriet sat in her office reading a piece in the Chicago Tribune, questioning if a black judge could truly be unbiased in a racially charged case. Harriet felt a mix of frustration and resolve. She'd spent her career proving that justice transcended personal bias. At the same time, she knew from experience that the color of her skin often cast her in a suspicious light to those unwilling to see her qualifications first. She arrived at courtroom 25C to find it packed beyond capacity. People stood against the walls, the air thick with murmuring. Today's agenda included hearing O'Connor's defense witnesses. Harriet steeled herself. The defense called 2 fellow officers who had been present at the protest. They testified that O'Connor faced resistance, that Malik threatened violence, and that the crowd was unruly. But cross-examination by the prosecution highlighted inconsistencies in their testimonies. They contradicted each other about the protesters' actions. Moreover, the prosecution presented a second angle of cell phone footage showing O'Connor's immediate aggression toward Malik, undermining the claim that Malik instigated the violence. As Harriet listened, she couldn't help noticing O'Connor's growing agitation at the defense table. His attorney repeatedly whispered for him to calm down. O'Connor's eyes kept flicking over to Harriet, who remained expressionless, taking notes. There was a tightening around O'Connor's mouth every time Harriet sustained an objection against his attorney or allowed prosecution evidence. When the day's testimony ended, Harriet quietly informed the room that she would rule on several motions the following morning. The tension was palpable. Everyone sensed a crescendo was building, but no one knew how or when it would break. O'Connor rose from his seat, face stiff, ignoring the media's shouted questions. As he passed by Harriet's bench, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Harriet caught the phrase, though it was quiet enough that others might have missed it. The bailiff, a seasoned officer named Lamont Willis, noticed the look of alarm in Harriet's eyes. He approached Harriet discreetly. "Judge, is everything okay?" he asked. She forced a reassuring smile. "Yes, Mr. Willis. Let's just make sure security is tight tomorrow." Willis nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." That evening, Harriet found it hard to relax at home. She lived alone in a tastefully furnished condo overlooking a quieter stretch of the Chicago River. Normally, the view brought solace, but tonight her mind was on O'Connor's final words. She had presided over tough cases before, even dealt with defendants who threatened or resented her. Yet something about O'Connor's raw hostility unsettled her more deeply. She called her father a ritual she'd kept since her mother's passing. Her father, in his gravelly voice, offered gentle reassurance. "You stay strong, Harriet. Hate will always find a way to bark, but it won't bite if you don't let it." Harriet smiled wearily. "Thanks, Dad. I'm just being careful." She hung up and tried to read through trial transcripts, but her thoughts wouldn't stay on the page. They drifted back to her law school days, when she first encountered institutional racism up close, and how an old professor told her she'd need thicker skin than her white peers to serve it in the legal profession. She pushed those memories aside, reminding herself she was a judge now, not a frightened law student. Tomorrow, she'd do her job the way she always did, fairly, and without fear. The next morning, Harriet arrived at the Daily Center early. Security was noticeably tighter. Officer Willis greeted her outside the courtroom. "We've got extra personnel on standby," he said. Harriet thanked him, feeling a sliver of relief that the court administration took precautions. The hearing began with final arguments. The prosecution meticulously outlined O'Connor's actions, playing the video again to let the images speak for themselves. Then came the defense's desperate attempt to spin the narrative, focusing on the stress officers, face the chaos of protests, and the possibility that the video's audio was doctored. But most in the room recognized the logic was shaky. When Harriet cleared her throat and prepared to announce her decision on whether the case should go to trial, with all evidence admitted, you could hear a pin drop. She began measured and formal. Based on the evidence presented and the credibility of the witnesses, the court finds sufficient grounds to proceed to trial. The videos are deemed admissible. This court cannot dismiss the charges, as the defense has requested. Her words caused an eruption of murmurs and hushed commentary among the spectators. The activists in the gallery let out quiet sighs of relief, while several off-duty officers looked visibly angered. O'Connor's eyes flared with fury. Harriet tapped her gavel for order, her voice rising slightly. "Court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene to schedule the next steps." A swirl of movement followed. Reporters rushed for a soundbite. O'Connor's lawyer tried to shield him from cameras, and bailiffs escorted spectators out. Harriet gathered her files, feeling an odd sense of foreboding. She stood to exit through the back hallway when she suddenly heard a bark of rage behind her. "Stop, don't move," O'Connor shouted, his voice cracking. Gasps filled the courtroom. In a single horrifying moment, Harriet turned to see O'Connor's hand gripping the handle of his service weapon, newly retrieved from a holster concealed under his suit jacket. Security protocols generally prohibited firearms from being carried into a courtroom by non-bailiff officers unless authorized. How he managed to bring it in was a question that would loom large in the aftermath. Time seemed to slow. Harriet's heart hammered against her chest, adrenaline electrifying her senses. Panic broke out among the remaining spectators. Several people dove for cover behind benches, while Harriet's bailiff shouted, "Weapon, weapon!" The other officers in the room froze, momentarily stunned that one of their own would draw a gun on a judge. But O'Connor did not waver. He aimed the gun directly at Harriet. His eyes burned with a mix of rage and desperation. "All of you are against me. You think you can ruin my life," he bellowed, voice trembling. Harriet stood behind the judge's bench, raising her hands instinctively. She had no weapon. She had only her voice. "Officer O'Connor," she said, astonishingly calm, despite the terror gripping her insides. "Put down the weapon. No one wants this to escalate." But O'Connor let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can just do this to me because I'm a white cop? You can't. You took everything I worked for, and you're about to throw it away. I've given my life to this city." Behind O'Connor. His attorney tried to reason with him, hands raised as well. Derek put the gun down. "Please, this is not the way." Chaos rippled around them. Harriet's bailiff reached for his sidearm, but O'Connor noticed and swung his weapon around. "Don't even try it." In that moment, Harriet realized how fragile life could be. She'd never had a gun pointed directly at her in all her years on the bench, and certainly not by an officer. Something changed in Harriet's mind. In the hush of that standoff, she recalled the day she was sworn in the vow she made to uphold justice even at personal risk. In a voice that surprised even her, she spoke with steady authority. "Officer O'Connor, you are in contempt of court and in violation of the law. Drop your weapon immediately, or you will force us to use lethal force against you." He spun back toward her, seething. "You can't tell me what to do. You don't know what I've been through." But Harriet pressed on, ignoring the fear that screamed inside her. "I know you feel cornered," she said. "But if you pull that trigger, you'll lose everything. If you're innocent, a trial is your chance to prove it. This is not the answer." For an agonizing few seconds, O'Connor's hand shook on the gun. The tension in the courtroom was so thick that people barely breathed. If Harriet had blinked, she might have missed the subtle shift in O'Connor's stance the moment he seemed to consider lowering the weapon. But the respite was fleeting. He snapped back, face twisted with a wild glint in his eyes. "No. It's rigged against me. You people, I know how this goes." Suddenly, a thunderous voice boomed from behind the bench. It was Harriet's bailiff, Willis, accompanied by two other armed court officers. Willis had managed to flank O'Connor, while the officer's attention was on Harriet. Now all three had their weapons trained on O'Connor. "Drop the gun." Willis roared every syllable, echoing through the stunned courtroom. O'Connor whipped around, startled. In that half-second of indecision, Harriet thought he might fire in panic. Her entire life flashed before her eyes. Her father's proud face at her graduation. Her mother's gentle laughter. The nights she spent poring over law books. The giddy thrill of passing the bar exam. The day she won the election for judge. Her unwavering commitment to justice. Time felt suspended. Then, with a guttural shout, O'Connor's finger tightened on the trigger. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from O'Connor's gun. Willis had fired first. The bullet struck O'Connor's hand, causing him to drop the weapon. He let out a yelp of pain as the gun clattered to the floor. Immediately, Willis and the other bailiffs rushed him, pinning him to the ground. O'Connor writhed and cursed, blood trickling from his wounded hand. The entire room erupted in a mixture of screams, gasps, and frenzied movement. Harriet slumped against her chair, breath-ragged, the adrenaline crashing over her like a tidal wave. She watched, still reeling, as officers cuffed O'Connor. His eyes locked onto hers with pure hatred. "You'll pay for this," he spat. Chaos continued for several minutes. EMTs arrived and treated O'Connor's injured hand. Law enforcement swarmed the courtroom, cordoning off the area as a crime scene. A traumatized hush settled among those who remained. Harriet was escorted by security to a private conference room where paramedics checked her vitals. She was physically unharmed, but her nerves were frayed. Word spread fast through the courthouse. The unimaginable had happened. A uniformed police officer drew a gun on a sitting judge, nearly firing the shot that might have ended her life. Anger, fear, and disbelief rippled through the building. Some of O'Connor's fellow officers were outraged at his betrayal of the badge. Others reeled in shock, never expecting such a scenario to unfold in their own ranks. Harriet was given the rest of the day off from proceedings. She found herself in a quiet lounge, typically reserved for visiting judges, sipping water with shaking hands. Her father rushed to the courthouse upon hearing the news. The moment he saw her, he swept her into a tight embrace, tears in his eyes. Harriet clung to him, letting the storm of emotion she'd suppressed finally break free. She trembled as she recounted those agonizing moments when the gun was pointed at her. "That's not how justice is supposed to be," she whispered, voice cracking. Her father held her close. "You're alive, Harriet. That's what matters now." In the corridor, she could hear a flood of activity. Detectives and internal affairs officers were already investigating how O'Connor managed to bypass security. Anger at the system's lapses and at O'Connor's bigotry weighed on everyone's minds. In the days that followed, details emerged that painted an even darker picture. O'Connor had apparently harbored deep-seated racist beliefs. Investigators found posts on his social media accounts laced with inflammatory remarks about minorities. More concerning was the revelation that he'd received help smuggling his weapon into the courtroom. A fellow cop in the building had turned off the scanner's alarm on O'Connor's route, hoping to avoid frisking a brother in blue. The city was incensed. The media, which had been covering the excessive force case, now exploded with coverage of the near tragedy in courtroom 25C. Public trust in the police took another major blow. The department disavowed O'Connor's actions, launching a full-scale internal investigation. The mayor, in a press conference, expressed relief that Harriet wasn't harmed and emphasized the urgent need for stricter security reforms in all Chicago courthouses. Meanwhile, Harriet found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. Anger at O'Connor, sadness at how racism continued to poison her city, and an odd sense of guilt, as if somehow she had failed to foresee this. But she reminded herself that she did everything by the book. The onus was on O'Connor and the system that enabled him, not on her. A week later, Harriet returned to preside over a specially arranged hearing for O'Connor. However, she wasn't the one to judge him. That would have been a severe conflict of interest, given he had threatened her life. Instead, a senior judge, Leonard Silverstein, was assigned the case. Harriet attended as a witness. The atmosphere in the courtroom was somber. O'Connor, his right hand bandaged, stood flanked by federal marshals. Gone was the arrogance that once radiated off him. His eyes were sunken, and he seemed resigned to the consequences of his actions. The charges leveled against him were grave assault with a deadly weapon, contempt of court, and various other felonies. The prosecution also unearthed a litany of evidence demonstrating O'Connor's pattern of racial animus. They showed texts, social media posts, even testimonies from fellow officers claiming O'Connor frequently used derogatory language. It painted a picture of a man who felt unjustly persecuted by a changing world, lashing out at any perceived challenge to his authority. Harriet testified calmly about the moment O'Connor drew his weapon, how she feared for her life, yet pleaded for him to stand down. Throughout her testimony, O'Connor's gaze was mostly on the floor. He only once looked up at Harriet, and in that fleeting moment, she saw not just hatred, but also the crushing weight of self-inflicted ruin. In the end, Judge Silverstein denied any form of bail due to O'Connor's threat to public safety and flight risk. O'Connor was led out in cuffs, a broken man facing the bleak prospect of a lengthy prison term. The fallout was swift and unapologetic. The Chicago Police Department fired O'Connor, stripping him of his badge and pension. His name became synonymous with police corruption and racist misconduct. Activists who had once demanded justice for Malik Reese saw in O'Connor's downfall a grim vindication, a testament to the violence that can fester behind a badge when prejudice goes unchecked. In the broader community, renewed calls for police reform rang louder. High-ranking city officials proposed mandatory sensitivity training, stricter oversight of officers with multiple complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for racist behavior. The union that once might have shielded O'Connor distanced itself, condemning him as a disgrace to the profession. Harriet observed it all from a slight distance, her personal trauma mingled with a cautious hope for systemic change. If anything good could come from this fiasco, maybe it was the impetus for real accountability. In the weeks that followed, Harriet was given the option to take time off, but she refused. She knew the best way to heal was to continue her work, to show that she would not be intimidated from doing her job. She resumed her duties on the bench, though for a while she required additional security measures. She received letters of support from across the country, from retired judges to ordinary citizens, who commended her courage. Malik Reese's excessive force complaint ultimately concluded with a settlement from the city, and Malik would later speak about the ordeal as a turning point in his life. He found a renewed sense of purpose in advocacy, working with non-profits to address police accountability. Harriet and Malik met briefly in a courthouse corridor one day. Malik thanked her for her resilience, and Harriet offered words of encouragement. Their brief exchange felt symbolic of change, brewing the judge and the citizen united in pursuit of a fairer system. Yet Harriet was no naive idealist. She knew the road to true justice was long and winding, but she took comfort in every small victory. And ironically, the attempt on her life made her even more determined to uphold the law with unwavering fairness. Chicago, still reeling from the incident, did what it often did. It confronted its wounds and searched for ways to heal. The media ran stories on the city's complicated relationship with race and policing. Community forums sprang up across neighborhoods where activists, police representatives, and elected officials debated reforms. Some efforts were purely symbolic, but others promised lasting change. New oversight committees, a push for body cameras, and more transparent discipline for officers with repeated misconduct complaints. Harriet lent her voice to some of these discussions, appearing in public forums whenever possible. She spoke about the importance of due process, the rule of law, and the need for empathy on both sides. Though she had never sought a spotlight, she realized her story carried weight. If sharing her experience could help shift public consciousness, then she was willing to do so. Months passed, and the final chapter of O'Connor's case arrived. The once proud officer stood trial before Judge Silverstein. The evidence against him was overwhelming, from his misuse of force in Malik's arrest to the near-fatal standoff in Harriet's courtroom. O'Connor's attorney attempted an insanity defense, citing extreme stress and mental health issues, but psychiatrists found he was fit to stand trial. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on multiple counts, including attempted assault on a judge with a firearm. The sentencing hearing was subdued. O'Connor, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, appeared thinner, his hair unkempt. Family members sobbed quietly in the gallery. A hush descended when Judge Silverstein, in a measured tone, pronounced a sentence of 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least a decade. In that moment, the room fell silent in a way Harriet had never experienced. It wasn't just about O'Connor's punishment. It was the stark reminder of how hatred and abuse of power could so swiftly destroy a life while leaving a community rattled. After the sentence was passed, Harriet felt an odd sense of closure. The final stamp of justice had been applied. The city she hoped would learn from this tragedy, from the racism that had fueled O'Connor's downfall to the lethal potential of unchecked authority. Months turned into a year, then 2. Harriet continued her work, presiding over hundreds of cases. She saw petty crimes, civil disputes, child custody battles, and more. Each case reaffirmed her belief that justice, while imperfect, was worth striving for daily. Whenever she caught herself feeling vulnerable about that day in courtroom 25C, she reminded herself that fear was not an option. Malik Reese became an advocate for police reform, regularly speaking at high schools and youth centers. He often cited Harriet's calm bravery as an example of how individuals could stand up to injustices, no matter how deeply rooted they were. The reverberations of O'Connor's dramatic downfall influenced department policies. A number of officers left the force or retired early, unwilling to adapt to the new climate of accountability. Others rose to the challenge, forging new ties with community leaders. Some of the city's tensions eased not enough to solve centuries of systemic inequalities, but enough to spark renewed dialogue and incremental progress. Harriet occasionally met with her father for lunch at a small cafe near the Daily Center. He would glance at her pride shining in his eyes and say, "You're still here, Harriet. You showed them what justice is made of." She'd smile back, remembering all that had happened. The bullet that never struck her, the gavel she never abandoned, the vow she never betrayed. In the end, a racist cop had pulled a gun on a black judge in court. What happened next silenced the room and resonated far beyond its walls. Justice might have faltered that day, had Harriet Barnes and those sworn to uphold the law with her not stood firm. Instead, it became a catalyst for truth, a testament to the power of standing up against hatred, and a reminder that even when our ideals are tested at gunpoint, the pursuit of justice must never waver. Thank you for joining me on this dramatic and harrowing journey, where the tension of a single courtroom showdown exposed the fragile line between duty and prejudice. We witnessed how Officer Derek O'Connor's racism and abuse of power led him down a path of irreversible damage, and how Judge Harriet Barnes's courage and integrity stood as a beacon of hope. Real change isn't easy. It demands vigilance, accountability, and the belief that our justice system can rise above individual failures. If this story moved you, please help spread its message like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking narratives. Every action you take helps keep conversations about justice, equality, and accountability at the forefront. Together, we can keep shining a light on these issues and strive for a world where fairness and empathy triumph over hatred.